The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a feed catalog and a past-due notice from the bank. And from the moment Caleb Harding pulled it from the saddlebag, he could tell that whatever was written inside would change the course of everything he thought he knew about his quiet, unfinished life. The year was 1882, and the territory of Wyoming was still a place where a man could ride 3 days in any direction and never see another soul if the weather turned against him. Caleb ran the Harding Ranch, a modest but hard one spread of 600 acres pressed up against the base of the Laramie Mountains, where the pine trees grew thick on the ridgeline and the creek ran cold even in August. He had been running it alone for 2 years, ever since his wife Margaret had died of a fever that swept through the valley the spring before, leaving him with 3 boys, a half-built barn, and a grief so complete it had taken up residence in his chest like a stone that refused to dissolve no matter how many sunrises he watched or how many rows he plowed. His boys were named Thomas, who was 12 and old enough to carry real weight on the ranch, Eli, who was 9 and full of a restless energy that could not be contained by any fence or chore, and little Samuel, who was 6 and had Margaret's green eyes and a way of going quiet at supper that made Caleb's heart ache in a way he could not describe to another living person. The letter had come from Missouri. Caleb had placed an advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch some 6 weeks prior at the urging of his neighbor and only real friend, a weathered rancher named Pete Dawson who lived 4 miles east and had remarried 2 years after his own wife passed. The advertisement had been plain and honest in the way Caleb could not help but be, because dishonesty cost too much energy and he was already spending every ounce he had just to keep the ranch going and keep his boys fed and clean and educated enough to hold their own in the world. The advertisement read, "Widower rancher, 34, Wyoming Territory. 3 sons, ages 6 to 12. 600 acres, good water, solid house. Seeking a woman of character, honest nature, and practical disposition who is unafraid of hard work and wide open country. Write in care of the Laramie Post." He had not expected many replies. He had received exactly one. He held the envelope in his hand as he walked back from the road to the ranch house, his boots kicking up the pale dust of September, the mountains behind him catching the last of the afternoon gold. He turned the envelope over. The handwriting on the front was precise and unhurried, each letter formed with a kind of deliberate care that told him the writer had taken her time. Her name, written in the return address corner, was Clara Ashworth, St. Louis, Missouri. The seal was plain wax, dark red, pressed flat. He did not open it immediately. He put it on the kitchen table and went back out to help Thomas finish repairing the section of fence the elk had broken through again. And then he came in and made the boys a supper of salt pork and fried cornbread and canned tomatoes from the cellar. And he listened to Eli argue that a coyote had been living under the back porch, and Samuel insist that the coyote was friendly. And Thomas maintain, with all the authority of his 12 years, that no coyote was ever friendly. And by the time supper was done and the plates were cleared, and Samuel had been wrestled into his nightshirt, the letter was still sitting there on the corner of the table where he had left it. He waited until all 3 boys were in their beds and the house had gone quiet except for the wind moving through the eaves, and then he sat down at the table with the lamp pulled close and he opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written front and back on good paper that smelled faintly of something he could not name. Cedar, maybe, or something green. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he suspects matters. It began, "Mr. Harding, I will not waste your time with pretty words about myself, because I have found that pretty words are usually a substitute for the truth, and I imagine a man running a ranch and raising 3 boys on his own has very little patience for substitutes of any kind." Caleb stopped reading for a moment and looked out the dark window at nothing. He kept reading. She wrote that her name was Clara Ashworth and that she was 28 years old. She had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis for 4 years, teaching children from the ages of 6 to 14 in a one-room schoolhouse on the east side of the city. She wrote that she was the daughter of a pharmacist who had died the previous winter, and that her mother had passed when Clara was 17, and that she had no siblings and no living relatives she was close to, and that she was not asking for sympathy in saying so, but only offering the plain facts of her situation so that he might understand her reasoning. She wrote that she had been engaged once to a man named Harold, and that Harold had decided after a year that he preferred a woman with more money and less opinion, and she had thanked God every day since for his cowardice because it had shown her something essential about herself, which was that she would rather be alone in a wide open place than comfortable in a small, constrained one. She did not know the West, she wrote. She had never been past the Missouri state line. She was not pretending to know what she was offering to walk into, and she thought it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But she was not a woman who frightened easily, and she had never in her life wanted things to be easy so much as she had wanted them to be real. She asked about his boys, not in a polite, obligatory way. She asked specific, real questions. What did they like to read, if they liked to read at all? What frightened them? Did they sleep well? Did they eat enough? She wrote that she had been in a room with children her whole adult life, and that she knew the way a child could carry a grief they did not have words for, and that if his boys had been carrying something heavy since their mother passed, she did not want to add to that weight. She signed it, sincerely, Clara Ashworth. And then below her signature in a slightly different pen, as though she had set the letter down and come back to it, she had written one more line. I am not looking for a transaction, Mr. Harding. I am looking for a life. Caleb sat with that letter for a long time. The lamp burned low. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark hills and was answered, and then went quiet again. He read the letter twice more before he folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the table in front of him and pressed his hands flat against the wood on either side of it, the way a man presses down on something to feel that it is solid and real. He slept badly and woke before dawn and started the fire and stood over the coffee pot watching the water heat, and he decided before the sun had fully cleared the mountains that he would read the letter to the boys at supper. He did not know entirely why. It was not the kind of thing ranchers in 1882 Wyoming did, reading their private correspondence aloud to children. But these were his boys, and whatever happened on this ranch happened to all of them equally, and he had made a promise to himself after Margaret died that he would not make large decisions in the silence of his own grief, and then impose those decisions on 3 children who had no voice in their own lives. They were old enough to have an opinion about this. At least Thomas and Eli were, and Samuel, God love him, always had opinions about everything, even if they were the opinions of a 6-year-old who believed in friendly coyotes. So he worked through the day, and he kept the letter in his shirt pocket, and he felt it there, the slight crinkle of the paper, and more than once he caught himself thinking about that final line. I am not looking for a transaction. I am looking for a life. At supper he made a proper meal, venison stew with carrots and onions from the garden and biscuits that were not his finest work but were respectable, and he waited until they had been eating for a few minutes, and the edge had come off their hunger, and they were at that comfortable mid-meal ease. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the letter. Thomas looked at it immediately. He was a serious boy with Caleb's dark hair and a way of watching the world that made him seem older than he was. Eli kept eating, but his eyes tracked upward from his bowl. Samuel had a piece of biscuit in each hand and stopped chewing entirely. I want to read you something, Caleb said. He did not explain what it was first. He just unfolded it and began to read. He read them the whole thing, every word in his plain and steady voice. He read the part about her being a schoolteacher. He read the part about her father dying and her mother passing young. He skipped nothing. He read the part about Harold and her deciding she would rather be alone in a wide place than comfortable in a small one, and Eli made a small sound that might have been approval. He read the part where she asked about the boys, the specific questions, the real ones. What frightened them? Did they sleep well? Did they carry something heavy? When he read that part, Samuel set down both pieces of biscuit. Caleb read to the end. He read the last line. "I'm not looking for a transaction, Mr. Harding. I am looking for a life." He folded the letter and set it beside his bowl and looked at his 3 sons. Thomas was staring at the middle of the table, his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was thinking hard about something. Eli had put down his spoon. Samuel was looking at Caleb with those green eyes, Margaret's eyes, wide and unblinking. It was Thomas who spoke first. He looked up slowly and said, "She sounds like home." Eli turned to look at his brother and something passed across his face, some recognition, some release, and he nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly, "she does." Samuel looked at both of his brothers and then at his father and said, with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old who has just decided something irrevocable, "I want to write her a letter." Caleb felt something in his chest that he had not felt in 2 years. Not quite joy, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that moved, something that was not the stone anymore. He wrote back to Clara Ashworth that same night. He answered her questions first, because she had asked them genuinely and they deserved genuine answers. He wrote that Thomas liked history and maps and would spend an entire rainy afternoon with an atlas if you let him, and that Eli liked horses with a passion that bordered on religious, and that Samuel liked everything and was afraid of thunderstorms and pretended he was not. He wrote that they ate well enough in summer when the garden was producing, and the hunting was good, but that winter stretched everyone thin, not just in food but in spirit. He wrote that, yes, he believed his boys were carrying something heavy, and that he did not know how to take it from them, and that there were moments when he looked at Samuel going quiet at supper and felt himself failing in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with farming or fence mending. And then he wrote, because he believed she deserved the same honesty she had given him, "I am not a man who is easy to know quickly. I am told I am quiet to the point of being difficult, and I have enough experience with myself to believe it. I do not have polished manners or much patience for anything that is not genuine. My ranch is far from everything and the winters are longer than most people can imagine if they have not experienced them. I am not trying to discourage you. I am trying to tell you the truth because you asked for it, and because I think you are a woman who would know if she was being told less than the truth and would not respect me for it." He paused, his pen hovering, and then he wrote, "My boys listened to your letter at supper tonight. Thomas said you sound like home. I thought you should know that." He sealed the letter and rode to town before sunrise to catch the morning post, and then he came back and worked his land and waited. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks in Wyoming in late September and early October was not an idle thing. There were fence lines to ride and check before the first hard freeze, firewood to cut and stack in quantities that always seemed impossible, and yet somehow were never quite enough, the root cellar to stock and seal, the horses to be looked after with extra care as the temperatures dropped, and 3 boys to keep clothed and fed and schooled and sane through the long evenings when the darkness came down early and the wind made the house walls creak and breathe. Caleb threw himself into the work with everything he had, which was his standard mode of operation and also, he recognized, his most reliable method of not thinking about things he could not control. He could not control whether Clara Ashworth wrote back. He could not control what she would decide. He could do this fence post. He could split this wood. He could make this supper and sit at this table with these boys and do the daily, necessary, endless work of keeping things alive. Samuel asked about the letter on a Monday. He came and found Caleb in the barn where Caleb was checking the bay mare's left front shoe, and he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and said, very seriously, "Papa, did she write back yet?" "Not yet, Bud. When will she?" "I don't know." Samuel considered this with the thoughtful gravity of a child examining a complicated moral question. "Do you think she liked our letter?" Caleb had told Samuel about the letter he'd sent back, including the part where he'd mentioned what Thomas had said. Samuel had been exceedingly pleased about this. "I think she's probably still reading it," Caleb said. Samuel seemed satisfied with this answer and went back out to look for Eli, who was almost certainly spending unauthorized time in the paddock with his favorite gelding, a dark brown horse named Scout, who Eli treated with a devotion that Caleb privately found both touching and slightly alarming. The letter from Clara came on a Wednesday, and Caleb found it when he rode into Laramie for supplies. He almost did not open it in town, but then he thought about the 3 weeks he had spent not thinking about it, and decided he was done being disciplined about this one thing, and he sat on the bench outside the general store in the cold October air and opened it. She had written back immediately upon receiving his letter, she said. She apologized for the delay, which had been the Postal Service's fault entirely, as there had been some confusion with the Laramie post distribution. She informed him, written and discarded 4 drafts of this reply before arriving at the one she was sending now, because she kept catching herself performing politeness instead of speaking plainly, and she found that irritating in herself. She wrote that what he had said about Samuel going quiet at supper had kept her awake 3 nights running, and that she knew exactly what he meant, though she could not explain how she knew it, only that she had seen it in children before, that particular silence that was not peace but something more like held breath, a child waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. She wrote that she was not frightened of the cold or the distance or the work. She had survived St. Louis winters in a drafty schoolhouse with a single wood stove and 40 children who all needed something different from her simultaneously, and she believed that had been sufficient preparation for most things. She wrote that she would like to come to Wyoming. She wrote it plainly, without preamble or elaborate qualification. I would like to come to Wyoming and meet you and your sons, and I think we ought to do this before winter makes travel impossible. So if you are willing to receive me, I will make the arrangements. And then, after her signature, in that same slightly different pen as before, I told my landlady I was considering going west, and she looked at me as though I had announced I was going to the moon. I found I did not mind at all. Caleb read the letter twice there on the bench outside the general store, with the October wind pushing at him from the northwest, and a freight wagon rumbling down the main street of Laramie raising dust, and then he folded it, stood up, went inside, bought his supplies, and rode home. He told the boys that evening. Thomas nodded slowly. Eli's eyes went wide and then went a scout through the window as if measuring whether the horse would be suitable for his purposes when the time came to demonstrate him. Samuel jumped up from his chair and knocked over his cup of water, and then stood in the spreading puddle looking at Caleb and said, "When? When is she coming?" "As soon as we can arrange it," Caleb said. "That is not a specific answer," Samuel said. "No," Caleb agreed. "It is not." He wrote back that night and told her that he would be very glad to receive her, and that she should travel by rail as far as Cheyenne and from there by stage to Laramie, and he would meet her in Laramie himself. He asked her to write and tell him the date so he would know when to expect her, and he told her she was welcome to stay as a guest in the house, and that there was a spare room that was decent and private, and that his boys had been informed they were to behave like civilized persons in her presence, which he suspected would hold for approximately 48 hours with Eli, but he was willing to be optimistic. He allowed himself one personal addition at the end. "Thomas said again last night that you sound like home. I am beginning to think he might be right." The arrangements that followed occupied the better part of 3 weeks. Clara needed to close her position at the school and find a replacement, settle her landlady's accounts, pack what she intended to bring, and arrange the rail passage. She wrote twice more in that time, practical letters full of logistics and questions about the ranch and the territory that he answered as fully and honestly as he could, including an unvarnished description of what Wyoming winters were actually like that he suspected would have deterred a woman of less conviction. She was not deterred. She arrived in Laramie on the 9th of November, 1882, on the stage from Cheyenne. Caleb had driven the wagon in that morning with Thomas beside him on the bench, because Thomas had asked to come, and Caleb had felt he deserved to. Eli and Samuel were left in the reluctant care of Pete Dawson, who had agreed with considerable amusement and what Caleb privately considered an insufficiently concealed grin. He stood outside the stage depot with his hat in his hands, watching the stage come down the main street of Laramie in the thin November cold, and he was aware that his heart was doing something he had not authorized it to do, which was to beat noticeably harder than the situation strictly required. He had been to war with himself all morning about this. He was a practical man. This was a practical arrangement. He was meeting a woman he had corresponded with about the possibility of a practical arrangement. That was all. The stage stopped. The door opened. Two men climbed out, then a large woman with a carpet bag, then a young man who was clearly not from anywhere west of Illinois, and then Clara Ashworth stepped down onto the street. She was of middle height, which was to say she came to Caleb's chin, with dark brown hair pulled back firmly and eyes that were gray in the flat November light and might be some other color in better conditions. She was wearing a practical traveling coat in a dark burgundy that was good quality without being showy, and she had a leather bag in one hand and a smaller satchel over her shoulder. She stood on the step of the stage and looked at the street and then looked at him directly, without the hesitant sideways glance he might have expected, and she said, "Mr. Harding." "Miss Ashworth," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, and he was struck by how much more real she was than the voice he had assembled from her letters, which had been vivid enough that he thought he had known what to expect. He had not. She was more alert than he had imagined, more present. She held herself with a self-possession that was not arrogance but something more like certainty, a woman who had decided long ago that she was going to take up her assigned space in the world and was not apologizing for it. "This is Thomas," Caleb said, stepping aside so Thomas could come forward. Thomas stepped up with his hand extended, which impressed Caleb because he had not coached him on this, and said, "Ma'am, I am glad to meet you." Clara shook his hand and looked at him with those gray eyes with every sign of taking him seriously, which Thomas clearly felt and stood slightly straighter for. "You are very like your letters," she said. Thomas blinked. "My papa showed you my letters." "Your papa wrote that you liked history and maps, and that tells a person a great deal." Thomas considered this, and then did something Caleb had not seen him do with a stranger in 2 years, which was smile. Not the polite, careful smile he gave to Pete Dawson's wife or the schoolteacher in town. A real one. Caleb retrieved her trunk from the top of the stage and loaded it into the wagon bed, and then he helped Clara up onto the bench beside Thomas and climbed up himself and clucked to the horses, and they rolled out of Laramie and onto the long road toward the mountains. Clara did not chatter. He appreciated this. She asked one question at a time, leaving room for full answers, and she looked at the country around her as they drove with a kind of deliberate attention, as though she was filing it away, learning it, not yet making judgments but not dismissing it either. The mountains were clear against the sky to the west, snow on the high peaks. The plains rolled out to the east in shades of brown and gold, the grass bent low by the wind, the sky enormous and blue with a few high, thin clouds moving fast. "It is very large," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was not entirely prepared for how large it is. Most people aren't." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think I like it." He glanced at her. She was looking at the mountains. Her profile in the cold winter light was composed and genuine, and she was not performing wonder for his benefit or his son's. She was simply looking at something large and real and deciding what she thought of it. "The house is decent," he said, "not fancy. I did not come looking for fancy." "Good." Thomas, wedged between them on the bench, was listening to this exchange with great care and evident satisfaction. They reached the ranch in the early afternoon. The wagon turning off the main road onto the long track that wound through the cottonwoods along the creek, and then up the slight rise to where the house sat backed against the lower slope of the mountain foothills. It was a good solid house of notched pine logs, 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full width of the front, and a stone chimney that Caleb had built himself, and was arguably the finest thing he had ever made. Smoke was rising from it, which meant Pete Dawson had kept the fire going as requested. Eli and Samuel came out of the house before the wagon had fully stopped. Eli came to the side of the wagon with the practiced ease of a boy who spent too much time around horses, and looked up at Clara with an expression of frank, unguarded assessment. He was compact and energetic and brown from the summer's sun, and he had a way of occupying more space than his 9-year-old body technically warranted. Samuel came behind him and stopped a few feet back and put his hands behind his back and looked at Clara with those green eyes and did not say anything at all, which was remarkable for Samuel and spoke to the depth of his feeling. Clara looked at Eli and then at Samuel and then back at Eli. "You must be Eli," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, without the usual edge of impatience he brought to formal address. "And you," she said, looking at Samuel, "you are Samuel." Samuel moved his hands from behind his back and wrapped his arms around himself instead. "Yes," he said, very quietly. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for Caleb's help, which he noted but did not remark on, and she crouched down so she was on Samuel's level, which was a thing he had never seen a grown woman do in a dusty ranch yard without any concern for her coat, and she said, "Your papa wrote and told me you wanted to write me a letter." Samuel's eyes went enormously wide. "He told you that?" "He did." "I was going to write that I have a coyote," Samuel said. "A friendly one, I understand." Samuel looked at his brothers with an expression of absolute vindication. Then he looked back at Clara and said, with enormous seriousness, "She lives under the porch." "I should very much like to meet her someday," Clara said. Samuel nodded as though this was a solemn agreement between equals, and then he turned and walked back toward the porch with the air of someone who has accomplished something important and can now rest. Eli watched this exchange and then looked at Caleb and gave him a small, decisive nod that said more than most speeches could have. Pete Dawson emerged from the house behind all of this, pulling on his coat, and took in the scene with his usual slow grin. He shook Clara's hand and told her she was a brave woman for coming this far west, and Clara told him without missing a beat that she preferred to think of herself as a curious one, and Pete laughed out loud and told Caleb he had better not let this one get away, which made Thomas choke on absolutely nothing and Eli stare at the sky, and Caleb felt warmth rise up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. That evening, Clara helped make supper. She had asked if she could help and he had said yes, and she had moved around his kitchen with the practical confidence of someone who had fed people in difficult conditions before, and she had found the dried herbs he had forgotten he had and used them, and the result was a venison stew that was notably better than his average venison stew, and nobody commented on this directly, but everyone ate more than usual. They sat at the table and Eli talked about Scout for a solid 10 minutes, testing her, Caleb thought, seeing if she would glaze over the way some adults did when children talked about their passions. Clara did not glaze over. She asked specific questions about the horse, what his temperament was, how he moved over rough ground, whether he was good in snow, and Eli answered each one with increasing velocity and enthusiasm, until he was nearly vibrating with the pleasure of being taken seriously. Thomas contributed more carefully, a detailed explanation of the map he was making of the surrounding territory, which he had been working on for months with the thoroughness of a military surveyor. Clara asked to see it after supper, and Thomas went very still for a moment, the way he did when something mattered enormously to him and he was trying not to show it, and then he said, "It is not finished." "Maps rarely are," Clara said. "The interesting thing is the process." Thomas got the map. Samuel fell asleep at the table over his second biscuit, which was his occasional habit, and Caleb carried him to bed. And when he came back downstairs, Clara and Thomas were bent over the unfinished map at the table, and Thomas was explaining his method of marking water sources, and Clara was listening with the full weight of her attention. And Caleb stood in the doorway watching them and felt the stone in his chest shift in a way that was so sudden and so profound, it nearly took his breath away. He went and stood on the porch in the cold dark until he had himself under control. The weeks that followed were, in their way, the most quietly extraordinary of his life. Clara was not a soft woman in the sense of being delicate or easily overwhelmed. She was soft in the way that mattered, which was that she had deep reserves of patience and warmth that she deployed without fanfare, without performing them, in the daily texture of life on the ranch. She was up every morning before the boys, which meant she was up nearly as early as Caleb, and she started the fire without being asked and made coffee the way he liked it without him telling her how he liked it, because she had simply noticed. She took over the boys' schooling within the first week. This had not been formally discussed. It had simply become apparent that she was better at it than the alternative, which was a combination of Caleb's evenings and the twice-weekly lessons in Laramie that required a full day of travel. She made Thomas a proper curriculum with attention to his particular love of geography and history, and she gave Eli reading assignments about horses and horsemanship that made him approach the subject with an enthusiasm previously unknown. And with Samuel, she had a gift that was almost uncanny, a way of getting inside his 6-year-old world and teaching from there, using the coyote under the porch and the creek and the mountains as texts. Samuel had stopped going quiet at supper within the second week. Caleb noticed this one evening with a shock of recognition, realizing mid-meal that Samuel had been talking for 20 minutes straight about something he had learned about beaver dams, and that the table was warm and noisy and full in a way it had not been in 2 years, and he had to look down at his plate for a moment and breathe carefully. He and Clara were not yet what either of them had perhaps hoped they might be. They were careful with each other in the way that people are careful when something matters enormously, and they are frightened of damaging it with impatience. They talked in the evenings after the boys were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and coffee going cold in their cups because they kept forgetting it while they talked about everything. He told her things he had not told another person, about Margaret, about the nature of grief, about what it was to watch your children carry something and not know how to take it from them, about the ranch and what it meant to him, not as property but as something closer to identity, the thing he had built with his hands against the country's resistance and his own doubt. She told him about her life in St. Louis, which was both smaller and larger than he had imagined from her letters. Smaller in its physical geography, the city, the schoolhouse, the boarding house where she had lived for 4 years in a room with a window that faced a brick wall. Larger in what she had seen and known there, the children who came to school hungry, the families struggling in a city that did not always struggle to accommodate them, the particular loneliness of being a single woman with opinions in a place that had decided what women with opinions were for. She was angry, sometimes, about those injustices, and she did not hide it or soften it for his benefit, which he respected absolutely. She told him about the black children who were excluded from her school by district policy, and about how she had felt about that exclusion and still felt about it, and he listened and did not deflect, because it mattered, and because it was part of who she was, and he was paying attention to all of it. He was falling in love with her. He knew this the way you know the season has changed. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones, each one slight enough to dismiss, and then one morning you step outside, and the air is unmistakably different, and you understand that the change has already happened fully, while you were looking elsewhere. The night it crystallized was a Wednesday in early December, 3 weeks after she had arrived. There had been a storm building all day from the northwest, the kind that the mountains channeled and compressed into something ferocious by the time it hit the valley, and by evening the wind was high and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. He had gone out after supper to secure the barn and check the horses and make sure everything that could be blown away was tied down or brought inside, and he had been out there an hour in the teeth of the wind and the first hard pellets of snow, And when he came back in through the kitchen door, stamping snow off his boots and pulling off his coat and hat, Clara was standing at the stove. She had kept the fire high and the house warm. She had a mug of coffee ready for him, which she handed him without comment, because she had heard him coming and known he would be cold. She had the lamp turned up bright, and the kitchen was warm and golden, and she was standing there in the lamplight with flour on her hands from whatever she had been making, and her hair had come partly loose from its arrangement, and she was looking at him with those gray eyes, which in the lamplight he had finally decided were not gray at all but a particular shade of blue that only showed in certain lights. He stood there with the coffee mug in both hands looking at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, "Everything secure?" "Yes," he said. She nodded and turned back to the stove, and he stood there for another moment knowing with absolute certainty that he had never in his life felt so unambiguously glad to be somewhere as he felt in this moment to be in this kitchen, in this house, on this particular piece of the world, and that the fact of her being in it was not incidental to that feeling. He set the mug down on the table. "Clara," he said. She turned around. He was not a man who had spent a great deal of his life making declarations. He was the kind of man who showed things through actions and trusted that careful observers would see them. But she was looking at him with that full, direct attention she brought to everything, and he thought that she deserved words, real ones, even if he was not graceful with them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to stay." She was quiet for a moment. "Not as a guest," he said. "I want you to stay permanently. I want to marry you. I understand that is a large thing to ask when you have known me for 3 weeks, and I am not asking you to answer tonight. I am asking you to know that I am asking." Clara set down whatever she had been holding, and she looked at him in a way that took him apart, quietly, from the inside out. She said, "I came to Wyoming knowing what I was coming to, Caleb. I did not come here to decide in 3 weeks. I came here because I had already decided." He took a breath. "You had." "I decided when you wrote me that Thomas said I sounded like home," she said. "I had never in my adult life been called anyone's home. I thought if there was a chance that was true, I had to come and find out." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, which was so entirely like her that he should have known she would. And he took her face in his hands that were still cold from the wind, and she did not flinch from the cold. And he kissed her in the warm lamplight of his kitchen with the storm building outside and the boys asleep upstairs. And it was the best thing he had done in 2 years, possibly longer. They were married in Laramie in January of 1883. The ceremony was performed by the justice of the peace, a stout man with impressive sideburns named Mr. Graham, in the small front parlor of the courthouse. Pete Dawson stood as witness and brought his wife Martha, who cried with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping for this outcome, since approximately the day Caleb had shown Pete the original advertisement, and Pete had immediately and enthusiastically interfered. Thomas stood to one side with his hands folded, and his expression composed and careful, watching his father and Clara exchange their vows with a 12-year-old's self-conscious dignity. Eli stood beside Thomas and fidgeted with the button on his coat for the entirety of the brief proceedings. Samuel stood directly in front of both of them in the middle of the floor and watched everything with Margaret's green eyes and an expression of concentrated joy. After, outside in the January cold with their breath-making clouds, Clara crouched down in front of Samuel, coat and all, and he put his arms around her neck and held on, and she held on too, and Caleb watched this over her shoulder and was very glad the cold gave him an excuse for whatever was happening to his face. The winter was long, as Wyoming winters always were, and they were married into it together, and the ranch house that had been quietly insufficient in its warmth for 2 years became, almost overnight, entirely sufficient. Not because Clara did anything dramatic or sweeping to change it, but because she inhabited it, and in inhabiting it she completed something that had been missing. She wrote a letter to the school board in Laramie in February, formally offering her qualifications as a teacher, and they accepted her before the spring melt because they were desperately short of qualified teachers in the territory, and she began making the twice-weekly trip to town to supplement the 3 teachers already employed, focusing on the older children whose education had stalled at the frontier basics. She was extraordinary at it. In the way she was extraordinary at most things she applied herself to, which was not ostentatiously but with a steady, producing excellence that built over time. Eli decided sometime in February that Clara was the finest person he had personally encountered outside the category of horses, which, for Eli, was the highest praise available. This decision was announced at supper one evening in February with his characteristic lack of ceremony. "Clara, I think you are the best," he said, and then went back to eating, and Clara looked at Caleb over Eli's head and pressed her lips together against a smile, and Caleb felt that movement in his chest again, the one that was warm and continuous and nothing at all like the stone. Spring came the way it always came in Wyoming, not gently but decisively, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes and the creek running loud and fast with snowmelt and the first pale grass pushing up through the mud, and with it came a liveliness to the ranch that the boys could barely contain. Eli was out at dawn every morning with Scout, the 2 of them ranging the fence lines and the creek banks with a freedom that was safe now that the mud was firm enough to ride on, and the creek could be forded without risk. Thomas began adding to his map with renewed energy, riding out with a compass and a notebook, and coming back with additions of increasing detail and accuracy. Samuel discovered that the coyote under the porch had had pups sometime in the deep winter, which was a matter of such significance to him that supper on the evening of the discovery was barely consumed by anyone because the conversation was entirely occupied. Clara told Caleb in April that she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening in the kitchen, which was where it seemed they resolved everything important, the kitchen being the room that was most fully theirs, the center of the house and the center of their life in it. She told him plainly in the direct way she told him everything, and he received it the same way, looking at her across the table with all the feeling he had in the world. He reached across the table and took her hand. He said, "How do you feel?" "Certain," she said. "A little frightened, mostly certain." "That is how I feel about most things I care about," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "I think it is a good thing," she said. "I think so too," he said. The boys received the news with their characteristic individual responses. Thomas processed it quietly and then came to Caleb later that evening and asked, with considerable seriousness, whether Caleb thought the baby would be a boy or a girl, as though this were a matter Caleb had some influence over. Eli immediately began building something in the barn that turned out, weeks later, to be a sort of small wooden cradle that was structurally ambitious if not entirely beautiful. Samuel declared that the baby would need to meet the coyote pups, and that this would happen and there would be no argument about it, which there was not. The summer of 1883 moved through the ranch like a long, good song, full of heat and work, and the particular pleasure of doing difficult things alongside people you love. Clara continued teaching through June before the summer recess, and in the meantime she worked with the boys on the ranch in the mornings, not as a favor to Caleb, but because she genuinely wanted to learn the land, and she did learn it, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She learned which sections of the fence needed checking after rain, which of the horses were skittish in wind, where the garden grew best, and where the soil was too rocky for root vegetables and had to be supplemented. Caleb watched her learn his land and felt a particular kind of love that he did not have a name for exactly, a love that was rooted in witnessing someone choose to belong to a place, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. There was one difficult week in July that he would afterward think of as the test. 3 riders came through the property claiming a right-of-way that did not exist, men employed by a large cattle operation out of Cheyenne that was in the process of expanding its range, and was not overly concerned about small ranches and their boundaries. They were not violent, but they were aggressive in the way of men who believed that persistence and size would accomplish what direct confrontation could not. The situation unfolded over 3 days, the men appearing on the property, being told to leave, departing, and reappearing. Caleb rode to Laramie on the 2nd day and consulted with the county land agent and confirmed in writing that his deed was clear and the claimed right-of-way was fiction. And he came home with the paperwork, and on the 3rd day he rode out to where the men were camped at the edge of his south pasture and showed them the papers, quietly and without heat, because heat was the thing they were hoping for. Clara had wanted to come with him on that 3rd day, and he had asked her to stay at the house, not because he doubted her courage, but because she was 6 months along and the south pasture was rough ground, and he did not want her on horseback on rough ground for that distance. She had argued this point, and then conceded it with a grace that he appreciated more than he said, which was a failing he was working on. When he came home the 3rd evening and told her the men had moved on, she simply said, "Good," in the tone of someone who had never doubted this would be the outcome, and went back to whatever she had been doing, which was mending a tear in Eli's coat. And he thought that was exactly right, that confidence in him that was not blind faith but something built from actually knowing him. The baby was born in October, on a Tuesday, which seemed right to Caleb because it had been a Tuesday when the first letter had arrived, though he did not say this aloud because he was not by nature a man given to poetic observations, though Clara was slowly and productively changing this about him. They named him James, for Caleb's father, who had died before Thomas was born and who Caleb had loved and missed in a quiet and constant way for 15 years. James arrived with considerable energy and opinion, which was immediately evident, and he had dark hair like Caleb and an expression in his first hours that suggested he already found the world interesting and was taking notes. Thomas held him first after Clara, with a solemnity and care that made Caleb feel his heart would simply break with the fullness of it. Eli held him next and immediately said that James had a good grip, which was high praise from Eli, who evaluated everything by standards of utility and physical performance. Samuel held him last, sitting on the floor with his back against the bed in the careful arrangement Caleb had set up, and he looked down at James for a very long time and then looked up at Clara and said, "He is the same as us now." Clara said, "Yes, he is exactly the same as you." Samuel nodded with profound satisfaction. That winter was different from the one before. James made it different, in the way that a new baby makes everything different, adding a density and urgency, and also a softness to daily life that is hard to account for in any systematic way. The nights were broken but not lonely. The boys were unexpectedly helpful, even Eli, who took it upon himself to develop an elaborate shushing technique whenever James was sleeping that was overkill but earnest. Thomas read to James in the evenings from his books, not because James understood any of it, but because Thomas had decided it was beneficial, and Thomas did not abandon beneficial practices once identified. Samuel introduced James to the coyote pups at the earliest possible opportunity, which was in late spring when James could sit up independently, and Caleb was present for this occasion and stood a careful distance away while Samuel, with great ceremony, held James in his lap and allowed one of the now half-grown pups to sniff the baby's outstretched hand, and James made a sound of pure, astonished delight, and Caleb thought that was about the finest sound he had ever heard in his life. The years moved in the way that good years do, which is to say they moved quickly and fully and left abundant evidence of themselves. Clara taught in Laramie until Thomas was old enough to go to the high school there, which happened in the fall of 1885 when he was 15, and the day she saw Thomas walk into the school building on his own, she stood on the street and watched him go with a complicated expression that Caleb, standing beside her, understood completely. She had taught Thomas everything that building contained and more, and now he was walking into it as a student who could meet whatever they had for him, and that was an achievement she had earned. She and Caleb argued sometimes. This was something he had not expected in any precise way, though he had known in principle that two people of strong character will disagree. They disagreed about the farm's finances in a stretch of bad years in 1884, when the cattle prices dropped, and the winter was devastating. Clara arguing for selling the south pasture to recover, and Caleb unwilling to let go of an acre. They disagreed about Eli's education, Clara pushing for him to go to the agricultural college in Fort Collins, Eli himself wanting nothing but the ranch and his horses. They disagreed occasionally about smaller things, about the right way to manage the garden or the proper amount of time to allow Caleb to be silent and unreachable in his own head before it became a problem for them both. But they argued and they worked it out. This was not a marriage of smooth surfaces. It was a marriage of two people with real grain, people who had both survived things and come out the other side with opinions and edges intact. And when they disagreed, they did so with the deep knowledge that the disagreement would resolve, that neither of them was going anywhere, that the argument was a feature and not a fault of a relationship built on genuine mutual regard. He kept the south pasture. They found another way through the bad year, cutting expenses and taking on a contract with the railroad to supply beef that got them through 1884 and into 1885 with the land intact. Clara was right that it would have been easier to sell. He was right that keeping it mattered in a way that was not entirely financial. They were both right, in the way that the truth is often divided between two people who are paying different kinds of attention. Eli did not go to Fort Collins. He stayed on the ranch and became, by his 18th year, the best horseman in the county, which was not an exaggeration but a simple fact attested to by everyone who watched him work. He had a gift for horses that went beyond training, something intuitive that translated to a quiet, authoritative communication between him and any animal he worked with. He began, at 17, training horses for other ranchers and operations in the territory, and by 18 he had a reputation that reached into Colorado. Clara had wanted more for him in the academic sense, but she made peace with it in the way she made peace with things she could not change, which was to redirect her energy toward what she could do, which was to make sure Eli had every resource and contact she could identify that would help him in the path he had chosen. She wrote letters on his behalf. She found him books on veterinary practice that she ordered from back east. She treated his choice with the same seriousness she gave Thomas's academic ambitions, because she understood that seriousness was what it deserved, and Eli knew this, and it was another of the 10,000 ways she had made herself indispensable not just to Caleb, but to all of them. Thomas came home from the high school in Laramie in 1887 with excellent marks and an offer of a place at the university in Boulder, Colorado, which had been established 5 years before. The offer was the result of Clara's letters on his behalf combined with Thomas's own considerable abilities, and the evening the letter came was one of the finest evenings Caleb remembered at that table. The whole family gathered, and Thomas reading the acceptance letter aloud in a voice that was only slightly unsteady, and James, who was 4 by then, and understood that something large and good was happening even if he did not understand what. Climbing onto Thomas's lap and patting his face with a serious 4-year-old hand, Thomas looked at Clara over James's head and said, "You did this. You did this," she said. "I only cleared some of the brush out of the road." Thomas shook his head. He was 16 and had become, in the way of boys his age, briefly awkward with sentiment, but he overcame it in this moment which told Caleb something about how he felt. He said, "You came here and you made it possible. I want you to know I know that." Clara pressed her lips together in the way she did when something moved her more than she intended. She said, "Go to school, Thomas. Learn everything." Thomas went to school in Boulder in the fall of 1887 and sent letters home every 2 weeks that were long and full and detailed in ways that spoke to someone who had been raised to pay attention to the world. And Clara read every one of them at the supper table, which had become their tradition, letters read aloud, the same way everything had started. Samuel, at 11, was growing into himself in ways that delighted everyone. He had his mother's eyes and something of both his parents in him, Caleb's quietness and Clara's curiosity, and he had also, uniquely, a gift for communication with animals that was so natural and complete that it had stopped surprising anyone on the ranch and had begun to bring interested visitors. The coyote pups from Clara's first winter were long gone into the hills, but the ranch had an assortment of creatures in various degrees of domesticity around it that all coexisted in a peace that Samuel maintained by some method that no one could entirely explain. James grew. He had Caleb's dark hair and something of Clara's gray-blue eyes, and he was loud and cheerful and insatiably curious about everything on the ranch and everything beyond it, and he followed his father around from the time he could walk with a faithful persistence that Caleb found alternately exhausting and the greatest joy of his daily existence. In the summer of 1888, Clara told Caleb she was expecting again. He was 39. She was 34. James was 4. The ranch was in the best condition it had been in years, the south pasture still theirs and producing, the house enlarged by an addition Caleb had built himself over the course of 2 winters, Thomas in his second year at the university, Eli with a thriving horse operation that made him financially independent at 19. It was a good time and a full life, and the news felt like a gift that he had not earned, but was going to accept with every ounce of gratitude he possessed. The second child, born in February of 1889, was a boy. They named him William, which had been Clara's father's name, and he arrived in a howling snowstorm in the middle of the night and seemed entirely undisturbed by this, looking up at the lamplight with dark eyes that held nothing but interest. James took one look at his baby brother and said, "He is small." "You were small once," Clara said. James looked deeply skeptical of this claim. Samuel, 13 and possessed of a serene confidence in his own judgment, held William for the first time with the practiced ease of someone who has done this before, which he had, and told Caleb quietly afterward that he thought William was going to be fine, which was Samuel's way of expressing approval of the fundamental arrangement of things. Eli came in from the barn smelling of horse and hay and looked at William from a respectful distance and said, "He looks strong," which was Eli's highest compliment, and then went back to the barn. Thomas came home from Boulder for a visit in March and held his newest brother with the same careful solemnity he had brought to all the significant moments of his life, and he looked at Clara over William's head and said, "Thank you," in a way that encompassed considerably more than the immediate occasion, and Clara understood it that way and nodded. The years continued their full, fast movement. Thomas graduated from the university in Boulder in 1890 with a degree in land surveying and returned to Wyoming, not to the ranch as a permanent resident, but to the territory, taking a position with the Territorial Land Office that put his map-making abilities to professional use and allowed him to live in Laramie and ride out to the ranch on weekends, which he did with regularity. He was 20 years old and serious and capable and deeply good, and watching him move through the world with competence and character was one of the continuous satisfactions of Caleb's life. Eli's reputation as a horseman extended by 1890 into Colorado and Montana, and he had been asked twice to travel to evaluate and train horses for large operations in those territories. He had gone, both times, and come back with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows they are precisely where they are supposed to be in the world, which was on a horse or near one, building something with his hands and his instinct. Samuel, 14 in 1890, had decided he wanted to be a doctor of veterinary medicine, which was a profession that was growing in the territories as ranching became more systematized and the care of livestock more formalized. Clara had researched this for him before he had fully articulated the wish, because she had been watching him and knew it was coming, and she had found that the Colorado State Agricultural College in Fort Collins had begun offering courses in veterinary medicine, and she presented this information to Samuel with her customary matter-of-fact thoroughness, and Samuel had received it with deep calm, as though the universe had confirmed something he had already privately known. James, at 6, was the most relentlessly energetic member of a family not short on energy, and had already demonstrated a mechanical aptitude that expressed itself in taking apart and reassembling every piece of equipment on the ranch that he could access, with mixed but generally successful results. Caleb watched this with a familiar parental combination of anxiety and admiration. Clara watched it with pure, delighted interest. William, at 1, had opinions about everything and expressed them loudly and without concern for the audience, which suggested he would be fine. On a June evening in 1890, with the mountains gold in the long summer light and the boys dispersed in their various locations, Thomas in Laramie, Eli in the barn, Samuel reading in the cottonwoods by the creek, James and William both asleep upstairs in the impossible peace of small children in summer, Caleb and Clara sat on the front porch in the 2 chairs they had placed there years ago and watched the sun go down behind the Laramie Mountains. The ranch was quiet around them. The horses moved in the paddock. A night bird started somewhere in the trees along the creek. The air was warm and smelled of pine and dry grass and the faint sweetness of something blooming on the hillside. Clara had her hands in her lap and her head tipped slightly back, watching the sky move through its colors, and she looked in this light, so entirely herself and so entirely at home here that Caleb had to stop and let the fact of it reach him fully, which it always did when he let himself attend to it properly. "What are you thinking?" she asked, without turning her head. He considered how to answer this truthfully, which was the only way he knew how to answer anything when it came to her. He said, "I am thinking that I wrote an advertisement for the Laramie paper 8 years ago that was approximately 4 sentences long and managed to be the most important thing I ever wrote." She turned her head and looked at him. The blue of her eyes was unmistakable in this light. "I almost did not answer it," she said. He had known this, in the way you know things about a person you have lived alongside for 8 years, but she had never said it directly. "What made you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The last of the sunlight was catching the peaks, that brief and extraordinary gold. She said, "You wrote that you were a widower, and that you had 3 boys aged 6 to 12, and that you had good water. You wrote that in the list of things the ranch had to recommend it. Good water. I thought that was honest in a way most men would not have bothered with, and I thought a man who was honest about good water would probably be honest about everything else." He looked at her. He felt that warmth in his chest that had replaced the stone so long ago it was difficult now to remember the stone, though he had not forgotten it entirely and did not want to, because remembering it was how he understood what it meant not to have it anymore. "Good water," he said. "Good water," she agreed. The night bird called again from the cottonwoods, and in the paddock Scout lifted his head and looked at the mountains, and the last gold on the peaks softened and went away, and the sky turned the dark blue of evening, full of the first stars. He reached over and took her hand where it lay in her lap. She turned her palm over and held his, the way she always did, the way she had done at the kitchen table 8 years ago when he had sat there across from her in the lamplight and felt the world reorder itself around the simple fact of her presence in it. Inside the house, William made a sound that was not quite a cry, tested the air for response, and went quiet again. The horses settled. The creek ran in the dark among the cottonwoods, cold and clear, carrying the snowmelt down from the mountains the way it always had, the way it would long after all of them were gone, but not tonight, because tonight the porch was warm and full and everything that had been broken had been mended, and everyone who was supposed to be home was. Thomas wrote from Laramie twice a month, his letters detailed and thoughtful and full of the territory he was mapping, the creeks and ridgelines and survey markers, all of it finding its way into the permanent record, as Thomas had always intended it would. He was 20 years old and good at what he did, and surrounded by people who recognized it, and he came home with a young woman named Alina in the spring of 1891, a quiet person with dark hair and a dry sense of humor who taught school in Laramie, and who looked at Thomas the way Clara had observed deserving people looked at Thomas, which was with recognition, the sense of having found something you had been looking for without being able to name it. Clara liked Alina immediately. Caleb liked her at a slightly more measured pace, which was his nature, and which Alina seemed to understand and not be troubled by, which was, Clara told him afterward, itself a sign of good judgment on Alina's part. They were engaged by the summer of 1891 and married that fall in Laramie in an actual church this time, because Alina's family was from town and her mother had views about the proper setting for weddings. Caleb and Clara sat together in the third pew and watched Thomas stand at the front of that small church in his good suit looking at Alina coming down the aisle with an expression that Caleb recognized in his bones. And he reached under the pew and found Clara's hand and held it, and she leaned her shoulder against his, which was enough. Eli, at 20 in 1891, had the beginnings of a serious understanding with a young woman named Ada Reeves, whose family had a ranch north of Laramie, and who was as direct and practical and horse-inclined as Eli himself. She had grown up in Wyoming and could ride and rope and read the weather from the color of the sky, and she and Eli communicated in a language that was largely nonverbal and concerned primarily with the quality and character of horses, which suited them both perfectly. They were not yet formally anything, but they had that particular ease with each other that was its own kind of declaration. Samuel left for Fort Collins in the fall of 1891, 17 years old, taking the stage to Cheyenne and the train south, carrying a trunk that Clara had packed with a thoroughness that spoke to how much she was going to miss him, though she saw him to the stage with a steady face and told him to write and eat enough and look after the animals he was going to be responsible for. Samuel had hugged her with the same complete sureness with which he had approached everything in his life, and told her he would be fine, and Clara had believed him, and he was. James, at 8, became in Samuel's absence the primary chronicler of ranch life in the letters sent to Samuel in Fort Collins, which meant the letters contained excellent and thoroughly detailed accounts of every mechanical thing that had broken and been fixed, and everything the horses had done, and everything William had done, and they were a reliable source of amusement to the entire family. William, at 3 in 1892, was the loudest person on the ranch and possibly in the county, and had no interest in being quiet about any aspect of his experience, which kept the house lively and occasionally exhausting and consistently full. On a January evening in 1893, 10 years and some weeks after Clara had first arrived in Laramie on the stage from Cheyenne, and stood on the street in the winter light and looked at Caleb across the dust of the main road, he was sitting at the kitchen table going over the account books for the year. The fire was high. The lamp was burning. Clara was at the other end of the table with a book she was reading, her feet tucked under her in the chair the way she sat in winter when the house was warm enough to be comfortable, her hair loose because it was evening and there was no one to see it but him. James was upstairs with William, the arrangement being that James, who was 10 and felt very senior, supervised William's bedtime on the nights when Caleb and Clara needed the kitchen to themselves for quiet things like accounts and reading. They could hear William's voice intermittently, testing arguments that James was patiently dismantling, and the ordinary night sounds of the house, the fire, the wind, the creek, faint and far off. Caleb put down his pen and looked at the account books and then looked across the table at Clara. 10 years. He had been 34 when she arrived, and he was 44 now, which was not old but was enough years to have some sense of what they meant and what 10 years of any given thing meant. What these 10 years had meant. He thought about the advertisement, 4 sentences, good water. He thought about the letter arriving on a Tuesday in September, tucked between a feed catalog and a past due notice, with that precise, unhurried handwriting on the front. He thought about reading it aloud at the supper table. He thought about Thomas saying she sounds like home, in that voice that was 12 years old and certain and right. He thought about every letter after that one, and the wagon ride from Laramie with Thomas on the bench between them, and Samuel standing in the yard with his arms wrapped around himself and those wide green eyes. He thought about the kitchen in the December storm and what he had said and what she had said back. He thought about every evening at this table, every letter read aloud, every argument worked out, every morning fire and every cup of coffee and every supper where someone said something that made the table warm and full. "Clara," he said. She looked up from her book. The lamplight was on her face and her hair was loose, and she had the gray-blue eyes that were not gray at all in any light he'd learned well enough to read. "What?" she said. He did not say anything for a moment. He was a quiet man. He had always been a quiet man. But she had taught him over 10 years that quiet was not a substitute for expression but only one of its registers, and that the other registers were also his to use if he chose to. "I am glad you answered the advertisement," he said. She looked at him with all of her attention, which was the thing he had loved first and loved most consistently. That full, unhesitating attention she gave to everything she judged worth giving it to. "I am glad you wrote it honestly," she said. "Good water and everything." He smiled, which was something he did with his whole face these days, something that had come back to him so gradually he had not noticed until one morning he caught himself in the glass above the washstand and stood there surprised. She smiled back, and it was her real smile, the one she did not perform, the one that reached the corner of her eyes. Outside, the creek ran in the dark under the January stars. Inside the house, 10 years old and solid in its logs and stone, 2 children moved toward sleep under the watch of an older brother who would be very good at many things in his life. And in the kitchen the accounts were good and the fire was high, and the lamp was burning between the 2 people who had found their way to each other through the unremarkable miracle of 4 honest sentences. And the rest was here. It was all here. It was this. It was home. In the spring of 1893, Thomas and Alina had their first child, a boy they named Caleb after his grandfather, which was something Thomas had written to tell them before the baby arrived, and which had required Caleb to step out of the house and stand by the barn for 10 minutes collecting himself before he could tell Clara about it. And Clara had known without being told and had not said anything, just handed him his coffee when he came back in, which was exactly right. Little Caleb was brought to the ranch for the first time in June, when he was 2 months old, and Caleb held his grandson on the front porch in the summer morning and felt the full circle of things, of time moving and love accumulating, and nothing that had been real being lost even when the shape of things changed. And James came and stood beside him, and looked at the baby with the grave consideration of a 10-year-old examining a new fact about the world. And William came and stood on his other side and said, "He is small," in the exact words and tone James had used about William 4 years before, which made Clara laugh from the doorway with her whole self, the full, rich laugh she brought out when she was entirely happy and not managing herself at all. It was, Caleb thought, the finest morning in a life that had now accumulated enough of them that they were like the mountains behind the ranch, solid and distinct, and continuously there when you looked up. Samuel came home from Fort Collins for the summer of 1893, and he had become, at 18, what he had been going to be all along, which was a person of extraordinary steadiness and competence who moved through the world in his own quiet orbit and made things better in it. He had 2 more years at the college, and then he intended to come back to Wyoming and set up a veterinary practice in Laramie, which was a plan Clara had supported from the beginning, and which Caleb had understood, was correct the first time he watched Samuel put his hand on a sick horse's neck, and talk to it in that low voice that had some essential thing in it that animals recognized. He brought a girl home, too, which he had not mentioned in advance, a classmate named Ruth who was studying alongside him and who was from a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, and who had the same quality of stillness that Samuel had, that particular interior quiet, and watching the two of them together at the supper table was like watching two instruments play in harmony, no performance, just the natural sound of things that fit. Clara watched Ruth at supper and then looked at Caleb and barely moved her chin, and he barely moved his in return, which was the language of 10 years of knowing each other, and it said, "Yes, this is the one." Eli married Ada Reeves in October of 1893 on the Reeves family ranch north of Laramie, in an outdoor ceremony that was necessarily brief due to the October weather and perfect in its brevity, practical and real in the way Eli was practical and real. Ada wore her mother's dress and rode to the ceremony on her own horse, side saddle in deference to the occasion, which was the only concession she made to formality, and Eli watched her ride up and looked at her the way he had always looked at the things in the world he loved most, with complete and uncomplicated certainty. The ranch in that fall of 1893 had grown and changed from what it had been in 1882, and yet it was also entirely itself, the same 600 acres, the same creek, the same mountains catching the last light on their peaks in the early dark of November. The house was larger. The barn was properly finished. The fence lines were maintained. The garden was established over 11 years of Clara's attention into something that produced abundantly enough to store through the winters. There were grandchildren now, and future grandchildren coming, and sons in the world doing things that mattered, and a life on this land that had been built out of the plain and honest material of two people who had told each other the truth from the beginning. On a Tuesday in November, 1893, Caleb rode to town for supplies and found a letter in the post. He was 44 years old, and his hair had gone gray at the temples, and his hands were rougher than they had been, and his body knew the land in the way bodies do after decades of working it, in the joints and the muscles and the particular weight of it in his sleep. He was a man who had worked and grieved and loved and built, and he was a man who had been found or had found, depending on which letter you were counting. He sat on the bench outside the general store in the November cold, the same bench on which he had sat 11 years ago and opened Clara's second letter and read "I would like to come to Wyoming." He sat there now with the new letter in his hand and opened it. It was from Samuel. It was brief. "Dear Papa and Clara," he wrote. "I have asked Ruth to marry me. She has said yes. I wanted to tell you both first. I will write with details as soon as there are details. I love you both, and I have wanted to say that plainly for a while, so I am saying it now. Your son, Samuel." Caleb folded the letter and sat in the November cold for a moment looking at the street of Laramie, the freight wagons and the horses tied at the rails, and the people moving along the wooden sidewalks in their coats, the ordinary life of a territorial town in 1893. Not yet a state, though Wyoming had become one in 1890, taking the wide land and its mountains and its creeks and its difficult winters and its people into the permanent record of the country. He thought about a Tuesday 11 years ago and a letter with precise, careful handwriting, and a woman who had decided that she would rather be alone in a wide open place than comfortable in a small, constrained one, and who had chosen this wide open place and had been more than right about it. He bought his supplies and rode home. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in at the stove, James at the table doing his schoolwork, William asleep on the settle in the corner in the particular violent completeness with which 5-year-olds sleep. Caleb came in and hung up his coat and hat and went to the stove and stood beside her and handed her Samuel's letter without preamble. She read it. He watched her read it, the small movements of her face, the way her eyes went soft at the line about love. She folded it and held it in both hands and looked at him. "He is happy," she said. "Yes. We should have them all home for Christmas," she said. "Everyone. Thomas and Alina and little Caleb and Eli and Ada and Samuel and Ruth. Everyone home." "That is a great many people in this house," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." And she said it as though that were itself the point, which of course it was. He put his hand on her back, which was his most habitual expression of everything he felt, and she leaned into it, which was hers. Christmas of 1893 was everything Clara had intended it to be. The house was full in a way that tested its capacity and did not exceed it, which was a matter of careful arrangement and cheerful disregard for personal space. Thomas and Alina arrived from Laramie with little Caleb, who was 7 months old and engaged in the project of pulling himself upright on any available surface. Eli and Ada came from the north, Ada already showing the early signs of a pregnancy that she and Eli had announced with their characteristic economy of expression. "We are expecting in the spring," Ada said at supper, and the table erupted, and Ada looked at the eruption with a calm satisfaction that confirmed everything about her character. Samuel and Ruth arrived by stage from Cheyenne, Ruth meeting the whole family at once with a composure that impressed everyone, and which Samuel clearly regarded as one of her finest qualities, which was an accurate assessment. James, at 10, was in his element with a house full of people to talk to and things to explain. William, at 5, divided his time between trying to climb on Eli and attempting to communicate with little Caleb, the two of them conducting negotiations across a developmental gap that was nevertheless not as wide as it appeared. Ada held William on her lap at supper one evening, and he put his hand on her round middle with the frank curiosity of a 5-year-old and said, "Is there a baby in there?" And she said, "Yes," and he said, "Good," and went back to eating, which was the fullest endorsement he was capable of. On Christmas evening they were all at the table, which could not hold them all comfortably but held them all, chairs angled and elbows careful, and the food passed in a cheerful relay. The lamp was high. The fire was burning in both hearths. Outside the mountain night was cold and clear and full of stars. Caleb looked down the length of the table. He looked at Thomas, 22 and solid and good, at Alina beside him, at little Caleb in her arms doing his level best to investigate the contents of the nearest dish. He looked at Eli, 21 and quiet as always, and Ada with her hand on her stomach and the calm certainty in her face. He looked at Samuel, 18 and steady as stone, and Ruth beside him with that interior stillness that matched Samuel's own. He looked at James with his wide-open face and the endless questions forming visibly behind his eyes. He looked at William, who had somehow managed to get something on his forehead. He looked at Clara. Clara was looking at him. She had been watching him look down the table, and her expression was the one she had when something moved her deeply, and she was not hiding it. The open, unguarded face she saved for the moments she trusted completely. He could not say, across the noise and warmth of the full table, what he wanted to say, which was something approximate to, "I did not know this was possible. I did not know that one letter, 4 sentences, good water, could become all of this. I did not know that one woman answering honestly could fill every empty room." He could not say it. He held her eyes instead, and she held his, and in the long look between them was everything that did not need to be said because it had already been lived. Then William said, very loudly, "Papa, I spilled." And everyone looked, and it was definitely not just on his forehead, and the moment broke open into laughter and the scraping of chairs and napkins deployed, and James offering assistance of deeply uncertain usefulness, and Ada holding her stomach and laughing, and Thomas with his hand over his mouth trying to maintain any dignity, and Alina giving up entirely, and Samuel, steady Samuel, simply taking the napkin from Caleb's hands and dealing with William directly, which was the most Samuel thing in the world. And Clara laughed. She laughed the way she laughed when she was entirely happy with all of herself, and the sound of it filled the kitchen of the house that had been full now for 11 years, on this piece of land at the foot of the Laramie Mountains, in the territory, and then the state of Wyoming, in the country that was young and rough and real. And Caleb, 44 years old with gray at his temples and calluses on his hands, and 10 years of Tuesday mornings with this woman and the stone replaced so long ago he had almost forgotten the weight of it, listened to her laugh and thought that was the finest thing, that was all of it, that was the whole answer to every question he had ever thought to put to the world. He had written 4 honest sentences. She had answered. Thomas had been right. She sounded like home. She was.